Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part three of the core perspective. I think this is actually going to be a very special edition, and I'm super excited to have you here today. But I'm also excited about the conversation that we are going to be having here today. My name is Leonard Mamorobo. I'm investment analyst at Net Group Investments, and today I'm here with my awesome colleague Tracy Jensen. Tracy, welcome.
Thanks, Leonard.
Tracy is an actuary. She also specializes in retirement income solutions, things like digital advice and online tools, and even passive investments. Now, in the world of science, even in the world of science, we often hear that, things change a lot. One time you're told that, margarine and milk is good for you, and then the next, they are bad for you. But I think this is actually the essence of the conversation that we're going to be having here today, which is asking the right questions. Now, if you look at the presentation, you would actually notice, some carrots over there. But I don't know how many of you have actually heard of this say, but throughout my life, I've been told that, carrots are good for your eyes and they help improve, your vision. And I think I actually firstly heard of this, from my mother. And I don't know about you, Tracy, but I was really forced to eat tons of carrots and, clearly didn't work out so well. But this conversation today sort of prompted me to go look this up. And I spent the past few days, just trying to dig into the research, just trying to find some direct link. And I actually found two things. So the first one is that there isn't any scientific paper out there that's actually supports the claims. And I think the second one is that, this carrots myth actually first originated in World War II, when the British actually, had this new technology called, radar. And I think radar actually sort of allowed most of the British pilots to sort of spot and kill most of the German, pilots and their planes. And obviously the British didn't want the Germans to know about this. And with everything that was happening at the time, there were actually two things that were really going on. One, it was really expensive to import food into Britain. And so most of the locals were sort of obviously encouraged, to sort of grow food more naturally. And, what is easy to grow? Carrots. And I think at the time as well, the second thing is that they had this new technology. And so the British government sort of decided to sort of start a new spending propaganda to its own people, that the reason why their pilots had a very good night vision, or they were able to kill so many of the German pilots even at night, is because of, they were eating a lot of carrots, and sort of hoping that most of the German spies in Britain will sort of pick up, on that intel, and send it back home, and obviously, confuse the enemy. But I think this is actually not to say that, carrots are not good for you or for vitamin A, but to say that eating a lot of carrots does not actually increase or improve, your vision. And the difference is between this reality and sort of common consensus, I think, is what sort of brings it home to what we are going to be talking to you about today, which is the secrets about sequencing of your return risk. Now, who does this affect? This affects, say, more of most of your retirees, so investors who are drawing an income very frequently. But first things first, what is sequencing of your return risk? Now, in simple terms, the idea of sequencing of your return risk is that, what your wealth sort of accumulates to, what you have left and how long it actually lasts you, is not only driven by the returns that you get, but also the sequence at which your returns come. And so, because when you are in retirement, you're drawing an income, you sort of start to run this additional risk, that you get very great long-term returns, but you actually get there by having a very bad start and a wonderful finish. So basically today we're talking about the negative returns at the start that are very detrimental for your wealth, even maybe before the positive returns even show up. And I know most of us actually understand the concept of market risk, but a few of us actually understand or are familiar with the subset of sequencing of your return risk. And I think that, how do we even, what is the impact? How do we even manage this risk? And so could I actually sort of just reduce my volatility in my portfolio, sort of reducing my high risk assets, would that actually lead to improved outcomes? What about actually what most people say, using different buckets, where I put my money into different buckets, does that actually become a very good mitigating strategy? And in helping me unpack this today, Tracy, I know you have a very perfect storm example for us today. Take it away.
Thanks, Leonard. Just quickly before we get into that example, I just want to make you aware that this is not just about retirees. We are going to be using that as an example because that's the norm and the most common one, but it's anybody who's making withdrawals. It could be trusts, mining rehabilitation funds, and the likes. So let's get into that example Leonard mentioned. So imagine now you're about to retire. It's the start of 2008. Things are great. Markets have done well. You're feeling good about it. And you decide you're going to draw down 10%, which is relatively high. You start out with your R1,000,000. So in year one, you're going to draw 100,000 as your income, and you're going to try and grow that with inflation every year. On top of that, you're going to be invested in a high equity fund, which means you have predominantly shares and equity. So really, you start out thinking everything is great. Not long into this, you hit the global financial crisis. And we're going to follow this example through all the way until the end of June this year. And we're going to look at a few different examples. First, what actually happened? If you just went along with this and you didn't change anything, what was your outcome? How much money did you have left from your million by the end of June? Then imagine we had a magic wand and we could wave this and say, instead of earning these lumpy, bumpy up and down returns, we could smooth that out and earn the same return every single month. So we're just earning that average return, but in a smooth manner. And then the last two I want to focus on is what I typically see in most publications and media articles is where you rank the returns from the worst first and then the second worst and so forth until you get to the best, and vice versa, because that's normally the articles and where I see the focus is. So let's start there. Well, if I ranked my return from the worst first and ended with the best, I would have only had about 200,000 left at the end of June this year. And you can see that little target indicates I couldn't even keep pace with inflation on my income. However, if I flip that around, I would have had 2 million. So that's 10 times different. So I think we can end now, Leonard, because it's pretty important. And so there's obviously more to that, like the carrot story. It's not always what you first see. So let's unpack that a bit further. Well, if I took things as they actually came, I would have had about 300,000 by June this year, which is only fractionally more than if I ranked it from the worst to the best. However, if I had this magic wand again and I could make my returns perfectly smooth and equal every month, I would have also only had about 300,000. So not that different. And in all of the first three examples, I missed my income target. So we can see, despite the fact that there was this very volatile period, my actual outcome was very similar to if I could have smoothed that out. So what's actually going on here? So as I said, most of the time when you see this spoken about this topic and published, you see this ranking from worst to best and best to worst. And that's very misleading because reality is never, ever going to be perfectly ordered like that. I think sometimes we all wish we could order our lives so perfectly, but that's not how the world actually works. So what's much more important is to actually say, if I got the same return over the period, but I could get it smoothly so that I got the same every month, how does that look? And that's really reality. So really we're starting to get a sense that maybe things are a little bit different than what they seem.
Now, let me just come in there, Tracy. So that difference is, between reality and some of the misleading information that is out there. would you actually not say that, you just actually picked one point in time to just, sort of try to prove your point? Was this sort of stress tested, going back or something like that? Yeah.
So that's a great question, because I think often, not just in our industry, but in the science world, like we said, we pick these things that support our beliefs. And we know there's behavioral biases around that. But more than that, as a retiree or somebody approaching retirement who's listening, or even for financial planners, you don't want a strategy that maybe works here, but doesn't work here, and works here, but doesn't work here. You want a strategy that's going to work no matter when you retire. So let's look at a few different dates. So here, what I'm showing here, it's the same 1 million rand. And what we've put here in dot one, our person one retired in Jan 2008, as we saw. They're drawing 10%, they're in a high equity fund, so everything's exactly the same. But 10 years in, we took a snapshot of how much they had left. Why 10 years? Because we're concerned about returns early on, and we want to see if they can recover from poor returns early on. So we don't want to make the period too long. So person one, we gave them two options. Do you want the magic wand and you can get equal and smooth returns, or you're going to take things as they actually come? And so the purple line is, well, the purple dot, sorry, is what happens if you had the magic wand. And this person 10 years in would have had about 580,000 left. If they didn't have this and they took things as they came, they would have only had just over 500,000. So what about person two, who retired a month later in February 2008? Well, they have a similar story. If they had the magic wand, they would have been slightly better off than if they had taken things as they came. But you can see they're not that different. I mean, there's not a massive difference. And then we move to person three, who retired in March, and similar story. So I'm going to fill up this with all different people. So there's about 123 people, all who retired on a different month. So if you do that, this is what it looks like. And I'm just going to join these dots. Each dot represents a person so that we can see and make the comparison a little bit easier. So if I connect that, what you can see is generally the green line is higher than the purple, meaning I would have been better if I didn't interfere, if I didn't use my magic wand, and I just took things as they came. And there's a few periods where that's different, and I've highlighted those in brown. And what you can see here is people who retired and quite early on in their retirement went through the global financial crisis, they would have been better waving this magic wand. So I thought about this, because we're going to come to what do we do about it shortly. And I thought, well, what is it about these periods? Is there something we can draw out and pull out that might help us mitigate what's actually going on here? So when I looked at it, 98% of the time, if my return in the first 3 years was less than what I was drawing as an income, my 10%, then I would have been better off waving this magic wand. So that 3-year income number is really critical, and that's what we really need to focus on when we look at how we can mitigate this. So to pull this all together before we get to the really interesting part is, how much does it matter? So to recap, we looked at a snapshot 10 years into retirement, and how did somebody's retirement look? And the difference between getting smooth returns versus getting what actually happened is not as big as we often see in the media and in these studies. And in fact, where the gap was larger was when returns were really good. So those people retiring sort of 2003, 2004, that sort of period. And there, if you had taken things as they actually came, you would have had quite a bit more than if you had tried to mitigate. So what is this critical period? As you saw, it's the first 3 years that is the most important in terms of our returns versus our income. And the most important question for today, so what? What should I do about this? And as Leonard alluded to, we're going to do 2 different tests. The one is we're going to see, well, if I hold less in shares and property so that my ride isn't as bumpy and I've got a little bit of a smoother journey, is that going to help? Because that's really what we're concerned about, is volatility and ups and downs. And then secondly, we're going to test this bucket system where we have a safe bucket in a cash type holding. And there we're going to focus on putting 3 years of income into that safe bucket, because we saw that it's the first 3 years that are really the important ones to focus on. So let's test how each of these fare, beginning with bucketing. Now there's a lot of different variations on bucketing, so I'm just going to look at 2 today. And both of them, we're going to have a safe bucket and a risky bucket. So I've called it safe. So safe means a cash-like investment. It's earning interest. And for these examples today, I've used the core income fund, which is basically an enhanced money market fund. So it gives you a slightly higher return than what you see in the published interest rates. And we're going to fill 3 years of income into this bucket. So this person's taking 10%. So we're focusing, I should have mentioned that, on the same example, the 1 million rand example with somebody taking 10%. So they're going to put 300,000 into the safe bucket, the cash type bucket, and they've got 700,000 left that they're going to put into this risky bucket. And that's the same high equity fund we've been focusing on, where you've got predominantly shares and property in there. And we're only going to take our income from the safe bucket until there's nothing left in that bucket, till it's empty. And we're not going to fill it up. When that's empty, then we will start taking our income from the other buckets. So the idea is our first 3 years of income should come from the cash investment. So let's do this comparison again. So we're going to look at these 123 people because we want a strategy that will work no matter when we retire. We don't want to pick a spot that's going to prove our point. So let's see how this works for the 123 retirees. And again, we're going to take a snapshot 10 years into their retirement. So how much do they have left of their 1 million they started with? Okay, so again, our green line is take it as it comes, no bucketing. I'm going to take my chances with the market and hope for the best. And the orange line here, and again, I've connected all the people so it's easier to look at and compare. The orange line is if I followed this bucketing method. Now, what's interesting is, if you recall from the first one, the same people who would have been better off waving the magic wand are the same people where bucketing would have been better, which makes sense because those were the people who hit the rough times, who hit the global financial crisis early on. And again, in the first chart, you also saw a little blip there at the start of 2002 for a few retirees. But it's not that much better. It's a little bit better, but it's not going to rescue you from sort of the dire consequences of taking a 10% drawdown or going through a financial crisis. And then when you look at the good years, those who retired sort of 2003, 2004, 2005, you can see you would have been slightly worse off if you had employed bucketing, but not too much. It's not too bad. So overall, I've given this a meh face because it does help a little bit in the bad times, but it does cost you something in the good times. So
I mean, just coming in there, I mean, I've read a couple of papers and I've watched a couple of YouTube videos where actually, I mean, I understand how maybe this bucket system may not work, because your safe buckets, is depleted. And they were saying obviously that, if you actually continue sort of constantly topping up your safe bucket as you withdraw from it, that might actually be a better strategy, that you may actually see that orange line, just going above that green line that we're looking at.
So I think that's a great point, because you don't know when bad markets are going to come. So isn't it better to always have your safety with you?
Yeah.
So let's take a look at that. So our system B we're going to look at is we start up by filling our safe bucket with 3 years of income. So we put 300,000 in our cash type bucket, and we put the balance, the 700,000, in our risky bucket. And we're always going to take our income from the safe buckets. And we're going to keep topping this up, like you said, so that we're going to keep always 30% in the safe bucket and 70% in the risky. And only when we have a tiny bit of money left that we're forced to take the last little bit from the risky bucket and empty all our buckets. But for most of the time, we're going to take our income always from the safe bucket. And what's interesting is this is actually an asset allocation decision, because you're always keeping your buckets the same ratio. So let's see how that fares, and if by reducing, because we have here reduced our total exposure to risk assets by having the safe bucket always there, has that helped us? So again, the green line is I didn't do anything. I just went with things as they came. You can see Leonard's already saying, oh no. It does sound like a really, really good approach. It sounds very logical. And we're going to look again now at the orange line, the orange people. So every dot, remember, is a person. We're looking at 123 people. And the people who did employ this system during those bad years, even then it didn't help you 10 years in. You were the same place 10 years in. Now, it might have helped, or you might have felt better the first year or two, you know, when you really hit the bottom initially. But 10 years in, you weren't any better off. So it hasn't helped us with a better outcome, which is what we're trying to do. And then in those good years, it's actually been really detrimental. So this one gets a sad face because it cost you a lot and it didn't actually help you when you needed it. So if we shift gears a little bit away from bucketing and let's look at our second mitigating approach, which is what happens if I reduce the amount of shares and property I'm holding. So we've been focusing on this dark green, this high equity, which is about 75% in shares and property. And we know in the long run, it should give us the best return, depending on the period. So there are some periods when it doesn't, but in the long run, it should be a good investment. So we talk generally if you have 5 years plus. And then we can reduce it slightly to get to medium equity and reduce it even further to get to low equity. And as we move along, so we have less shares and property and hopefully less volatility. But on average, we expect lower returns. Now, it doesn't always play out like that way, so that's just on average. And I think what's important to highlight here is the fund we've been focusing on, the high equity type fund, is designed for a 5-year plus term. Now, a retiree in South Africa is generally expected to live 25 to 30 years, which is a lot longer than 5 years. But often I get asked, but because I'm making a withdrawal, surely it's different. So let's explore that. Is it different for a retiree? So again, we're going to look at 123 people who all had a different retirement date. And we're going to see, now they have 3 dots each. Should they have gone with low equity, medium, or high equity? Which one is best? So again, unfortunately, even in the bad times, you didn't get a better outcome. Bearing in mind, this is a 10-year snapshot, again, not looking at it 1 or 2 years in. So it didn't help us mitigate that risk that we're concerned about. And on top of that, the cost here is even higher than before. You can see in many of these times, there was more than R1 million. Imagine having R1 million less 10 years into your retirement because you employed this. It's a very, very high cost mitigating strategy. So this one also gets a sad face because it didn't help us when we needed it, and it cost us, I think, the most out of any of them if you went all the way to low equity. But as with carrots, there may be more to the story. So unfortunately, we don't go sleep for 10 years and wake up and go, this is my outcome, and I got the same result. So what about investor behavior? How does that come into play, and how do we allow for that in looking at this? Because to date, we've been focusing on a 10-year snapshot. Now, Leonard, imagine this was your mother and you had advised her in January 2008 with R1 million to go high equity because it's the right thing. You saw this. And just over a year in, she looks at her statement and she phones you and she's got about 700,000. What would she say?
Sure. I'm sighing so high because I have no idea how I'd actually explain this to her. All I can say is she would definitely kill me. But yeah, I don't know what I would say.
Yeah. Not great. I mean, my dad retired quite recently and he's got a lot in offshore equity, and we all know what's happened there. So it would be a really, really hard conversation to have, whether you're a planner or even managing your own money. It would be very, very hard not to make an emotional decision at this point. And I've seen this especially with people who are retired because they have limited ability to bring in additional income. So it makes you even more nervous, which is completely understandable. But what happened after that? Well, you pretty much ticked along. It's actually for about 6 years. I've shown you the 5-year point here, but you pretty much had a similar amount of money. And then you started the decline. And by the end of June this year, you would have had just under 300,000. Now, I want to come back to our magic wand and look at this person, what their experience would have been like if they earned the same return over the whole period, but we made it equal returns. So it was the same return month in and month out. Well, it's like a very slow, steady decline. I mean, if your mom had 978,000 just over a year, and I think she'd be happy.
Yeah.
But she wouldn't have ended much better, on the equal return. So it felt a lot more comfortable. It's a little bit like how inflation used to be until recently, slowly eating away in the background, but actually it has an impact. So if we overlay these two and look at the two experiences somebody would have had, it's drastically different. I mean, as we said, just a year in, you'd be down massively. But interestingly enough, 5 years later, which is why I said I highlighted that point for a reason, you would have had a very similar amount of money. And then sometimes equal returns are better, sometimes taking things as they come are better, so they sort of crisscross over each other. But your behavioral experience would have been very different. So how do we tie this all together, and what do we do? So to summarize, we said, how significant is sequencing of returns? And we said, not as much as we're often made to believe, so sort of low to medium. But with everything, like the carrots, there's caveats. So that's looking at it over a decent period, sort of a 10-year period. Making sure you're in a well-diversified fund. So if I go put all my money into resource shares, it probably is a lot. It probably is quite significant. You're going to get a very different experience. But, and a big but, it can be very detrimental to investor behavior, and the outcome somebody gets is also determined by whether they can stay the course. So let's recap on those mitigating strategies. So I haven't even put bucketing B in because we saw bucketing B was just a no-go. So I'm only going to focus on bucket system A. And that can be quite valuable in practice. Why? Because in the bad times, it did help a little bit. It didn't cost you too much in the good times. But even more valuable than that is it helps with investor behavior. And I've seen this when I've met with many, many people and many retirees, knowing I have that safety net and that cash portion helps me to stick it out with the risky portion, because this is where I'm taking my income from. And the last one we looked at is, surely I should maybe reduce my risk assets because then I get a smoother ride. Let's decrease how much in shares and property I hold. And what we saw here is that it didn't help in the bad times. And again, I'm referring to a 10-year point. The journey along the way is a little bit different, but it didn't help when we needed it. And it was exceptionally costly. We saw there that somebody started with $1 million, could be $1 million less than they would have been had they gone high equity versus low equity. So it's exceptionally costly. So I've said this is not an ideal mitigating strategy. So you can see method A, of bucketing, I gave a smiley face because yes, I think in practice it's valuable, but reducing your risk assets just unfortunately is exceptionally costly.
Wow. And thank you very much, Tracy, just for bringing that investor behavior there at the end. But I guess the question then would be, would you say that, your portfolio withdrawal rates are more important than, your sequencing of your return risk?
So yeah, the withdrawal rate super critical. So there's 3 really important things people need to focus on. And that is your withdrawal rate, as you mentioned. But then there's also some other people who are taking out of your pot, and that's fees. So your withdrawal rates is coming out and your fees are coming out. So those are really important. And then as you saw, getting your asset allocation, your risk assets right. So those are really critical. The sequencing risk, you need to manage the behavior, but it's not as critical as getting those other 3 correct.
No, thank you very much, Tracy, for that insights and perspective. It's amazing how much I always learn every time I sort of chat to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to actually watch this insight again and our previous core perspectives, you can visit our YouTube video at Net Group Investments. Just make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, so that you get videos every time we drop. And for any of our future events, you can visit our LinkedIn page at Net Group Investments. I think from me and the rest of the Net Group Investments team, goodbye and thank you.